theist named Jimmy coming out of Texas who is curious about psychedelics and what they maybe can suggest about God. What's your question for us today, Jimmy?
Yes, I'm sure you've heard the studies at Johns Hopkins where they had atheist volunteers who signed up for what they call psychedelically induced mystical experience. And when they found that they undergone this experience, they were no longer able to identify as atheists. And so I was wondering, how interested are you in psychedelics? Would you ever travel to Brazil where these things are legal and test that for yourself?
Yes. So let me clarify a little bit about the research that you're citing, and then sort of my role in talking about all of this. I am a psychedelic integration therapist, and so I do often work with clients who have experienced psychedelics and are working to make sense of all of those things, including these mystical experiences and perhaps even brushes with God. I'm also a ketamine-assisted psychotherapist, which means I actually work with clients who are self-administering ketamine, a dissociative psychedelic, dissociative anesthetic, and experiencing those things with them by helping them to verbally process and then to integrate all of those things. So I'm a clinician who has gotten my hands dirty in this field and have talked to a number of people about these types of experiences and looked at a lot of the research. Johns Hopkins has been doing some really fascinating studies with psilocybin, and there are a number of case reports and other pieces of evidence about people reporting back saying they had mystical experiences that felt godlike in nature, that perhaps made them question the nature of reality. There is nothing that I am aware of where psychedelics are administered to proclaim atheists who come out on the other side of the Sneetch machine with a godlike star and are now convinced that there is a God. Certainly people have interesting experiences and they work to interpret those experiences. And when you are working with psychedelics, there is the possibility for pretty dramatic change and growth. But I had a personal client of mine who was in the process of getting ready to take ketamine as part of our professional clinical work together, who became kind of nervous and pulled out after reading Reddit forums and some of these things pointing to some sort of half understood, regurgitated research around how psychedelics make people see God. And as we talked about it, and as we actually looked at all of that research, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that that's not actually what the data really says. So I know I'm coming to this, Jimmy, with a different set of skills and experiences than you. So I hope I haven't been too long-winded. How is everything that I'm saying landing for you?
Well, when you say you're not familiar, there's a particular study, online survey study that they've done at Johns Hopkins, and they published in the Public Library of Science. And I don't know if you've looked at that one, but it does specifically say about refer to atheists who were converted by this experience.
Yeah, I'm sure that there is some non-zero number, and I have seen data to indicate that there is a non-zero number of people who self-described as atheists who had experiences under psychedelics, who then did revisit issues of spirituality and perhaps came to different conclusions. And that doesn't mean that psychedelics make you see God, or that people who experience psychedelics universally, commonly, or really on any sort of meaningful level of statistical significance walk out convinced that there is something anyway resembling the Abrahamic God, for instance, or really anything else that we generally think of as a God.
And I'd actually go a little bit further in saying that these kinds of studies and insights, along with some personal experiences that I've had, just push me in the complete opposite direction. It is a refutation of the existence of these supernatural entities, because if we can induce things that would have been seen as visions or prophecy or speaking to God with a simple chemical, and we can dial that in and we can watch it happen on an MRI machine, then what we're proving in my mind, is that God's in the brain, and is just mental processes. And when I say God's in the brain, I don't mean an actual God. I mean that the things that people believed are God or gods or spirits are literally just all in your head.
Well, the reason I would disagree with something like that is because, neuroscience, I think, doesn't necessarily establish that consciousness is something generated by the brain. Another thing I would note is that...
don't go on to another thing. I'm sorry. That one thing is enough for me to chew on all day. Say that part again? That consciousness is not generated by the brain?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything within neuroscience that definitively states that, consciousness is something necessarily generated by the brain.
I mean, I don't know about the word definitively, and I would say that any good science is always exploring deeper explorations. I would also maybe decenter the quote-unquote brain. People miss out on the reality that their nervous system covers so much more than just our brain. And consciousness, as we understand it, really does come from every fiber of our being. It's an emergent property of all of these different complex systems interacting with each other in ways that are really chaotic and difficult for us to grasp and truly understand. But consciousness comes from inside the body to the extent that we are able to explore and understand such things.
And I would also add, if you think it's something else, let me just say this, if you think it's something else, then you're going to have to provide some kind of evidence, something compelling, something that we would be able to test. Because if you just say, yeah, well, it might be a God, I'm like, well, you're going to have to prove it.
Could be a lot of things, right?
Yeah, could be aliens, could be a wizard. I don't know. But we have what we have in terms of data, and everything that we know points to it coming from within. As Christy said.
Well, I would agree with Christy in that it's a transactional relationship with the external and the internal. But another thing I wanted to add was that the studies at Johns Hopkins, they specifically use, I don't know what you use in your psychedelic assisted therapy or if you use microdoses, but in the studies at Johns Hopkins, they specifically use a single high dose, which is the equivalent of what Terence McKenna called the heroic dose. And
Man, I'm so sorry. I have to interrupt you again, Jimmy. I'm sorry to be difficult, but the term heroic dose, these legendary doses, is almost always, if you are seeing that phrase, go ahead and find another study. Go ahead and find another research article or something else to look at. I don't mean to be curt or to throw out a major claim like that, but I can say pretty plainly that the research that came out of Johns Hopkins did not use the phrase heroic dose. Whoever you are reading that from did not adequately describe the actual scientific paper that was published.
Yeah, it sounds more Hunter Thompson than Johns Hopkins to me.
I actually got this from Dr. Roland Griffiths himself. He's the one that used that phrase. And, in describing the types of doses they're using, in other words, they're using a high enough dose to bombard what they call the default mode network. This is
all doses of psilocybin, for instance, are going to maybe not quote bombard, but are going to be impacting the default mode network and are going to create a system in our brain effectively where the things that we are used to thinking about are of less consequence, and less used brain systems are coming more online. So that's a little bit about how these compounds actually impact the brain. But this notion of a heroic dose, I'm not familiar with the researcher that you are citing here. I'd be more than happy to take a look at it if you want to email it to me, but I have some real questions about it.
Yeah, tv@atheist-community.org. Get that study in that email inbox and we will take a look at it.
Yeah, sincerely, I will.
Do you mind if I say one last thing?
Please.
Okay. Well, the term in psychology that I was referring to, ego death, they also call it non-dual consciousness, and that, it basically the subject-object dichotomy that you have in your experience, where you feel like you're a bodily entity roaming in an environment, that is completely dissolved inside this phenomenon. And that's why I always have issue with like people with like Matt Dillahunty, for instance, that talks about super strawberry. And in there's still an obvious subject-object dichotomy going on there, and so that's why I think he's definitely, whatever he's talking about, he's definitely not talking about what Johns Hopkins calls a complete mystical experience. And
right,
I'll leave it at that.
A mystical experience. It's just an experience. It's not. You're making this leap to God or something supernatural when it's just an experience. I've had some very strange experiences in my time. In my dreams, didn't mean that they were real.
Yeah, I mean, and I hear you saying that psilocybin or perhaps some of these other psychedelics can help us to experience, quote, ego death, and to help have an experience of non-dualism. But neuroscience says overwhelmingly that dualism, the dualistic brain model, does not make sense. We experience ourselves as being sort of maybe a disembodied voice, a soul. We experience ourselves as having consciousness as this kind of separate thing from our body. But we know from neuroscience, we know from a lot of personal experiences through meditation, through a lot of these things, that that is an illusion. The self is an illusion in a great number of ways, and scientific and even spiritual and faith traditions. This notion that psychedelics perhaps help us to understand that or help to reveal that to us on a felt level is a meaningful part of why psychedelic experiences can be so powerful in our healing and as our growth as humans, not because they are somehow allowing us to achieve like flipping a switch and becoming a different type of non-dualistic brain, but rather by helping to emphasize and reveal the reality that we are already always operating in that non-dualistic fashion. Your brain is a part of your body. Your brain is really a part of your nervous system. And all of these things are working together in various levels of congruence. And psychedelics have the ability to disrupt that congruence, to disrupt the normal operating patterns of these things. And that's an really incredibly remarkable and interesting thing. The brain, consciousness, the body, the nervous system, these are all very complex systems with a lot of moving pieces. And one of the best ways to understand a complex system is to take just one part of it and break it or change it, and then to see how the rest of these compensatory systems are affected. That helps us to better understand what this one piece that we turned off or broke or temporarily changed is doing as part of the larger system. So I do think that there is incredible value in psychedelic research into consciousness and what it can tell us about our brains and our bodies. I have seen firsthand and worked with a number of clients who have experienced psychedelics as a remarkable form of healing. And so where appropriate, when done correctly, when done through a medical model of sorts, there is a lot to be valued here. None of it gets me towards God.
One last question for you, Jimmy and Christy, because I think it's kind of, Jamie mentioned the supernatural. I think it's kind of unfair to characterize it that way, because I don't even think the professionals are talking about something that is defying the laws of physics. That's something impossible. It is what they call a biologically normal phenomenon in consciousness that they seem to be inducing. And even in the studies, I don't know how
you are saying that that's connecting to God, like a God, which is by its definition a supernatural entity. Like this is you want us to accept that these drugs open people up to God and they can't be atheists anymore. But that the implicit thing that's being said, at least from what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that therefore God exists. That these drugs are allowing people to access this being.
I know. Well, I'm a theist nonetheless, but yet I don't agree with the supernatural aspect. I don't think God necessarily has to be supernatural in the sense of define the laws of physics, depending on your interpretation of God, of course. For instance, in the studies, they kind of interpret it through the lens of what they refer to as the perennial philosophy, where they see this phenomenon in consciousness happening throughout history, and each of the religions has given it different names. Like in Christianity, it's called the Holy Spirit. In Buddhism, it's called Nirvana.
Well, this takes us on to an entirely different topic that I would almost be interested in sort of going into. Is that, well, what do you define as a god then? If it's an entirely natural thing within the scope of physics, and therefore couldn't do the kind of stuff that we see written in these texts, the Bible, the Torah, Bhagavad Gita, these amazing feats and being responsible for the world and everything in it and this kind of thing. What is your God then, if not that?
Well, having been influenced from experiences like these, it seems to be glimpsed inside those states of consciousness is what I would refer to as maybe unbounded consciousness, a consciousness where there's no limitations between life and death or time and space. And, I think people throughout history have referred to that.
You're just making it sound like the God's a state of mind then. I'm thoroughly confused about what you're trying to get to, because I will admit that these people have had these experiences. I have no reason to not doubt them under the influence of these powerful compounds, but bringing the word God into it when it's just like expanded consciousness or something like that, I have very little use for that God in terms of the overall picture. If a God's going to be a God to me, it's going to have to be external and more powerful than me, and have an impact on the world rather than just a thing I saw in a dream.
Well, I mean, the interpretation I've had after coming down from having an experience like this, I ended up being a kind of panentheistic understanding of the divine, where, there still is these attributes where I see God as something that does sustain reality with, that's where the unlimited power comes into play. But it's not like a Superman or some kind of external entity that's going to, prevent all sin on prayer.
I just call that physics, man. I think you call it God and I call it physics. It's just the understanding of the nature of the universe. And I don't have to give it the GOD. I just give it the PhD.
Yeah, well, I think then we just probably differ on our. Well, I guess that's my point, that when you have these type of experiences, that it transforms what you understand about the divine or God and the nature of the divine.
Having had those experiences myself, again, not to go into too much detail, but I've experienced these things myself. I saw some weird stuff. I had some very transcendental experiences. I did not gain a belief in God. I did not leave my atheism. And I think that co-opting terms like God and spirit and divine, I shy from that for reasons very serious, because there are people that use those terms as justification for heinous, hideous political machinations. So I would rather people, if you think there's some higher thing, don't call it God. Don't please use a different term, because that word has more baggage than flipping Heathrow Terminal 5. Sorry, a little bit of a side rant there. I apologize, but I saw God. Was it God? No, well, no, I just had a transcendental experience. Great. Please don't call it God.
And there is great value in exploring these things. There is great value in working to have a felt sense within your own nervous system, not just book reading, but actually experiencing for yourself that non-dualistic framework, so that it isn't just somebody explaining it to you. Somebody trying to explain to you about, for instance, like the optic blind spot, does not teach it to you the same way as actually experiencing it for yourself. I'm not going to go into detail about that idea here, but let me invite anybody who is maybe struggling with some of what Jimmy is saying, and Jimmy, you yourself, to do some research on the optic blind spot, and it will shake your worldview in maybe not the exact same way that you were saying these study participants had their worldview shaken, Jimmy, but it will help you to walk around the world going, the the way that I see is not the way that I think that I see. I think we intuitively, on some level, most of us sort of believe that our eyes are like two cameras, or maybe just one camera, I guess, that somehow converts the actual world into a video that we can see. And that system is actually incredibly complex and can be damaged and fucked with in a lot of ways. And understanding that really helps us to see the world as it is. And using words like God have a way of stopping us from being bothered to try and understand the world as it actually is.
No, I agree that it's hard to talk about these topics. And just as fervently as Jamie is against calling other things God, I kind of feel fervent in the different direction, or I think the external entity is probably the biggest straw man in history, so maybe we'll leave it at that. Thank you for taking my call.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Keep reading, and thank you for calling. You have a great Sunday.
Yeah, that felt like a pretty productive conversation. I think I know what you mean about the optic blind spot, and this isn't just a joke on my behalf, but it's like whenever your eyes move, you're technically blind for a fraction of a second. Is that the one?
It's really more the fact that there are places within our field of vision that we can't fully see, that our brain sort of fills in the gaps with in order to help maintain continuity in the videotape.
And because of flaws, and that's why I have an nystagmus, why my eyes wobble, because it's trying to compensate for that. Fascinating stuff. Absolutely look into it.